Naples, December 4, 1943. A queue of shivering civilians winds along the Via Roma, past bomb-scarred shop fronts and the wreckage of a city the retreating Germans deliberately starved of light and water. At the front of the queue, a woman lifts her collar. A young American soldier in a rubber apron pushes the nozzle of a hand-cranked duster down the back of her neck, along her sleeves, into the waistband of her skirt. A cloud of pale powder billows out and settles on her hair like the first snow of winter. She barely flinches. By now, tens of thousands of Neapolitans have been through this exact routine, and the whole operation has taken on the rhythm of a factory line. Collar, cuffs, waistband, done. Behind her, another 200 people are waiting. What is happening on that street corner looks almost comic from a distance, a kind of grim pantomime played out in a city already broken by war. It is nothing of the sort. Beneath the theater of dust and disinfectant, something genuinely unprecedented is underway. For the first time in history, a doctor's most feared companion of every major war, a disease that had trailed armies from Napoleon's retreat from Moscow to the trenches of the Eastern Front in the previous conflict, is about to be stopped in its tracks, deliberately, at scale, using a chemical that barely existed 5 years earlier. The disease is typhus. Not typhoid, a different illness entirely, but epidemic typhus, spread not by contaminated water but by the humble body louse. It thrives wherever people are cold, crowded, unwashed, and frightened, which in December 1943 describes most of liberated Naples. Refugees fleeing the fighting further north have crammed into cellars and caves. The sewers, wrecked by German engineers on their way out, have turned streets into open drains. Somewhere in that mass of misplaced humanity, a single infected louse has already begun to pass Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacterium behind the disease, from body to body. Within weeks, this outbreak will become the largest typhus epidemic to strike Western Europe in a generation. And yet, by the time it burns out in the spring of 1944, remarkably few Allied soldiers will have died of it. Meanwhile, in the frozen forests and crumbling garrisons of the Eastern Front, a very different story will be unfolding among the armies of the Reich, one measured not in isolated cases but in tens of thousands of dead. Two armies, fighting the same war against the same tiny parasite. One would very nearly conquer it, the other would be devoured by it. The story of how that happened is a story about chemistry, about eggs, about a Polish scientist smuggling sabotaged vaccines past the Gestapo, and about the sheer, unglamorous power of good logistics. For as long as armies had marched, typhus had marched with them. Historians sometimes call it camp fever or war fever because it appeared with such grim regularity wherever soldiers were packed together, poorly fed and unable to wash. Napoleon's Grande Armée, some 600,000 strong when it crossed into Russia in 1812, was torn apart as much by typhus and dysentery as by Russian steel. Barely a tenth of the force staggered home. A century later, the Eastern Front of the First World War and the chaos of the Russian Civil War produced an epidemic so severe that between 2 and 3 million people are estimated to have died of typhus in Russia alone between 1918 and 1922, out of perhaps 20 to 30 million infected. Winston Churchill, no stranger to hyperbole, was nonetheless making a fair medical point when he warned that the lice of the Eastern Front had killed more soldiers than the bullets. By the time the Second World War began, doctors understood the disease far better than their predecessors had. They knew it was carried by lice rather than filth in any direct sense, that it thrived in cold weather when people wore the same clothes for weeks without washing, and that mortality among the untreated could run anywhere from 10 to 40%. What they still lacked in September 1939 was any reliable way of stopping an outbreak once it started. Delousing meant boiling clothes, shaving heads, and steaming uniforms through mobile disinfection units, methods that were slow, laborious, and hopelessly inadequate for the scale of a continental war. A single delousing train might process a few hundred men in a day. An army group on the move might need to process hundreds of thousands. The problem was about to become acute. As German forces pushed into the Soviet Union in the summer and autumn of 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, they marched straight into one of the most louse-ridden regions on Earth, a landscape of ruined villages, freezing winters, and refugee columns that had incubated typhus for a century. As the German advance stalled and the harsh Russian winter closed in, soldiers who had been promised a swift campaign found themselves living in the same uniform for weeks at a time, sheltering in crowded, unheated buildings alongside civilians who were themselves already infected. It was, in the driest sense, a perfect laboratory for the disease. And on the other side of the world, American planners looking at the maps of North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Italy that their own troops would soon be fighting through, understood that Allied soldiers were walking into exactly the same danger. The question by 1943 was not whether typhus would strike Allied forces in Europe. It was whether anyone had found a way to stop it before it did. Two very different institutions were racing towards an answer, though neither fully realized at the time that they were in a race at all. The first breakthrough was chemical, and it came out of a Swiss dye company's laboratories of all places, rather than any military research establishment. In 1939, a chemist at J.R. Geigy in Basel named Paul Müller had been hunting for a better moth-proofing agent when he stumbled onto the astonishing killing power of a compound first synthesized decades earlier and then largely forgotten, dichlorobenzyltryptych chloroethane, mercifully abbreviated to DDT. Müller's tests showed the substance killed insects on contact and kept killing for weeks afterwards, long after the residue had dried on a surface. By 1943, with America's War Production Board pushing manufacturing towards its wartime maximum of around £3 million a month, the United States Typhus Commission, under Brigadier General Leon Fox, had already run small but successful trials dusting refugee populations in Mexico, Algeria, and Egypt. The second breakthrough was biological, and it belonged to the laboratory rather than the chemist's bench. An American researcher named Harold Cox, working with the techniques pioneered by his predecessors, had discovered a way to grow Rickettsia prowazekii, the typhus bacterium itself, inside the yolk sacs of fertilized chicken eggs. It sounds almost absurdly simple, and in a sense it was, but it solved a genuine bottleneck. Earlier vaccine production methods, most famously the one developed by the Polish scientist Rudolf Weigel, required technicians to feed live lice on human volunteers' skin for days at a time, then dissect the insect's infected guts by hand under a microscope, one louse at a time. It worked, and it worked well, but it could never be scaled to inoculate an army of millions. Cox's egg-based method could be industrialized in a way lice farming never could, turning a boutique laboratory technique into something closer to a production line. By late 1943, the Americans had both halves of the answer in hand: a chemical that could kill the louse itself, cheaply and at enormous scale, and a vaccine that could protect the soldier even if a louse got through anyway. What Naples offered, almost by accident, was the first real chance to prove it. The operation that unfolded in the city over the following weeks would later be remembered, with some justification, as one of the most effective public health interventions of the entire war. Under the direction of the Typhus Commission and Allied military government, teams set up dusting stations across Naples, at railway stations, air raid shelters, and street corners, exactly the kind of scene that opened this film. Each dusting gun, a hand-crank device roughly the size of a small bicycle pump, forced a fine cloud of 1% DDT powder into a person's clothing in a matter of seconds, at the collar, the cuffs, the waistband, everywhere a louse might hide. The dust itself was almost inert to human skin at that concentration, but lethal and durably so to the insects living in the fabric. Over the course of the campaign, more than 1 million people, soldiers and civilians together, were dusted, in what remains the first mass application of DDT anywhere in the world. Cases that had been climbing sharply through December 1943 began to fall almost as soon as the dusting stations were fully operational, and by February 1944, the epidemic that had threatened to become a full-blown civic catastrophe was effectively over. Precise mortality figures for the Neapolitan population remain difficult to pin down. Records from a city under military occupation and civil collapse were never going to be complete, but among Allied troops themselves, the outcome was stark and well-documented. Typhus, the disease that had haunted every previous European war, killed almost no American servicemen at all in Italy. The scale of the effort involved should not be underestimated. Dusting a single person took only a few seconds, but doing so for over 1 million people, day after day, through a Neapolitan winter, required an organizational effort roughly equivalent to running a small production line out on the open street. Teams worked in relays, restocking their dusting guns from sacks of powder stacked at the roadside, while military police kept the queues moving through air raid shelters, railway stations, and requisitioned cinemas pressed into service as makeshift processing centers. Soldiers who had trained for beach landings and mountain warfare instead found themselves spending entire shifts dusting the collars of strangers, an unglamorous form of combat against an enemy that could not be seen at all. It is easy, looking back, to underestimate quite how strange this must have felt at the time, an army fighting a war not with rifles but with hand pumps and chalky white powder, yet the discipline behind it was every bit as rigorous as anything asked of a frontline unit, and arguably rather more successful. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think and costs nothing at all. Compare that outcome to what was happening at the very same moment, several hundred miles to the east. The German army had entered the Soviet Union without DDT, because DDT effectively did not exist as a usable weapon until the Allies had it. Geigy's patents had been passed to British and American entomologists rather than German ones, and wartime supply chains ensured the compound never reached the Wehrmacht in anything like the quantities the Allies enjoyed. German medical authorities were not blind to the threat. They had their own vaccine program, built substantially on the earlier work of Rudolf Weigel, whose institute in Lwów was pressured into supplying doses for troops on the Eastern Front in exchange for being allowed to continue operating. But the German vaccine relied on the old, labor-intensive, lice-feeding production method, one that could never match the output of Cox's egg-based factories, and by most accounts the quality of what reached the front was inconsistent at best. In a quietly extraordinary act of resistance, Weigel and his staff are reported to have deliberately weakened a portion of the vaccine batches sent to German units, while smuggling tens of thousands of doses of the genuinely effective version into the ghettos of Lwów and Warsaw instead, an act of medical sabotage carried out under the noses of the men who were paying for the vaccine's production. Without an effective chemical delousing agent, and with a compromised vaccine supply, German forces on the Eastern Front were left largely dependent on the same 19th-century methods everyone had relied on in the previous war: steam disinfection trains, head shaving, and boiling uniforms, methods that simply could not keep pace with an army of millions living through a Russian winter in the same unwashed clothing for weeks on end. Typhus tore through German units during the retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941 and 1942, and flared again as the war ground on, contributing to a death toll among German soldiers, POWs, and the civilian populations under German control that ran into the tens of thousands at a minimum, and by some broader estimates considerably higher once the epidemics inside POW camps and the collapsing garrisons of the war's final year are included. Inside the concentration camp system itself, the disease became almost inseparable from the horror of the camps as a whole. Outbreaks at Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and elsewhere killed inmates by the tens of thousands, among them, in February 1945 at Bergen-Belsen, a 15-year-old girl named Anne Frank and her sister Margot, victims of the very disease the Americans had all but neutralized in Naples a little over a year earlier. The comparison between the two Allied vaccines used by British and American forces is itself instructive of just how methodically the Western Allies approached the problem. American troops received the Cox vaccine, grown in egg yolks and containing killed rickettsial organisms. British troops received a related but distinct preparation known as the Craigie vaccine, which combined epidemic typhus antigen with a related strain, murine typhus. Neither vaccine was perfect, and medical officers monitoring British personnel at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen documented several vaccinated soldiers who still contracted the disease. But neither service was relying on vaccination alone. It was the combination that mattered: DDT to kill the vector before it could bite, egg-based vaccines to blunt the disease if it slipped through anyway, and an industrial supply chain robust enough to put both into the hands of ordinary soldiers rather than a privileged few. Germany, fighting a two-front war with steadily collapsing infrastructure, could manage perhaps one element of that equation at a time. The Western Allies, by contrast, managed all three simultaneously, and did so before the war had even reached its final year. The wider legacy of what happened in Naples extended well beyond the war itself. Paul Muller received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1948 for his discovery of DDT's insecticidal properties, and in the years immediately following the war, the same dusting technique proven on the streets of Naples was deployed across a devastated Europe to prevent typhus from taking hold among the millions of refugees and displaced persons flooding the continent, almost certainly averting outbreaks that could have rivaled anything seen after the First World War. The compound's reputation would, of course, curdle badly within 2 decades, as concerns over its environmental persistence, crystallized by Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring, led to its restriction and eventual ban for agricultural use across much of the world. But its wartime record against typhus, whatever else history would come to say about it, was not seriously disputed even by its critics. Weigel's smuggled vaccines, meanwhile, are credited with having saved thousands of lives inside the ghettos his institute was never supposed to be helping, a quiet act of scientific defiance that received no wartime medals and little recognition until decades after his death. Today, samples and equipment connected to both programs, dusting guns of the type used in Naples, and documentation of Weigel's louse-feeding cages can be found in medical history collections in London, Washington, and Krakow, alongside the grim photographic record shot by Allied cameramen at the camps typhus helped to empty. It is worth being honest, too, about what the Naples campaign did not achieve. It did not eliminate typhus from the war, and it did not spare the millions of civilians trapped inside the Nazi camp system, for whom no dusting station and no Cox vaccine would ever arrive in time. The comparison at the heart of this story is specifically a military one, between the German army fighting typhus at the front and the American army doing the same, rather than a claim that Allied medicine somehow reached everyone who needed it. Historians studying Neapolitan sources have also cautioned against treating the DDT campaign as a flawless triumph, even within the city itself. Some of the epidemic's natural decline may have owed something to factors beyond the dusting program, and many Neapolitans experienced the outbreak and its ending rather differently to the tidy narrative that reached American newspapers in early 1944. What is not seriously disputed, however, is the outcome among Allied servicemen themselves, and the sheer scale of the gap between that outcome and the one endured by German forces fighting the same disease under the same wartime conditions without the same tools. What separated the two outcomes was never a difference in courage, nor even, in the main, a difference in medical knowledge. German scientists understood typhus every bit as well as their American counterparts, and in Rudolf Weigel, they arguably possessed the finest typhus vaccinologist alive. What separated the two outcomes was industrial capacity, chemical innovation arriving at precisely the right moment, and the ruthless logistical will to get both a powder and a vaccine into the hands of millions of ordinary people before the disease could reach them first. Germany fought Typhus with the tools of 1918. The Western Allies fought it with the tools of 1944, and the tools of 1944 won. Return for a moment to that street in Naples, to the woman in the queue with her collar lifted and a stranger's hand dusting powder down her back. She has no idea, standing there in December 1943, that she is taking part in a piece of medical history, the first mass deployment of a chemical that will define pest control for the rest of the century. She only knows that she is cold, that the war has wrecked her city, and that the soldiers seem confident this powder will keep the fever away. She is right to trust them. Some 400 miles east and several months later, in the frozen ruins of the collapsing Reich, no equivalent cue exists, no dusting gun, no reliable vaccine, only the same lice, the same fever, and a death toll that would climb into the tens of thousands among soldiers alone, and very much higher once the camps are counted. Two armies faced the same invisible enemy. One met it with chemistry, with eggs, with dusting guns and disciplined supply chains, and very nearly walked away unscathed. The other met it with the methods of a previous generation, and paid for that gap with an escalating body count it could never fully explain to its own soldiers. Typhus did not choose sides in the Second World War. It simply found on one side of the front line an enemy that had finally learned how to stop it, and on the other, an army still fighting the last war's disease with the last war's tools. In the end, the louse proved a more honest judge of who had truly modernized than any battlefield could.